Hello and welcome back to Media Ecology for the online community as Classroom. This episode's called Words, Words, Words. So eventually I want to talk about computers and the internet in light of media ecology, but to do that, we need to build on the OG of media ecology, the self-described intellectual thug himself, Marshall McLuhan. However, McLuhan famously, definitively, intrinsically had no concepts. To ascribe concepts to him would be to undermine him completely. So I can't just give you a list of McLuhan's ideas. In lieu of concepts, he offered percepts, his way of sensing the modern environment. So in order to explain McLuhan, we have to retrace his life story and his learning so as to acquire our own sense of his perception of the world. So that'll take some time, but it's an investment that'll pay off in spades. For instance, his most well-known book, Understanding Media, their chapters of this book are assigned in media courses all over the world. The book is very difficult to understand until you get a sense of where he's coming from and why he writes the way he does. The next few videos will establish precisely that. Now, I don't have an arts degree or a history degree, so I'm looking forward to learning more perspective on lots of the stuff I'll be mentioning here. What I'm striving to relate with the utmost fidelity is McLuhan's well-studied yet likely idiosyncratic perspective on this art and history and whatnot. So anything that I get totally wrong should be presumed to be out of my own fault or ignorance. So let me know. Marshall McLuhan. Herbert Marshall McLuhan was born in Edmonton, Alberta in 1911. His mother, Elsie McLuhan, was a professional elocutionist, and she toured the country performing one-woman stage shows of popular plays where she played all the parts. At home, she would recite epic poetry from memory while doing housework. Elsie trained Marshall and his siblings on the art of releasing the full meaning of words in carefully considered dramatic oratory. Conversations at home were lively, and very heated debates were had at the dinner table on many subjects. And from the clamor of this boisterous household, Marshall often escaped into reading. Lots of reading. He also developed a lifelong habit of learning and using 3 new words every single day. At the University of Manitoba, after 1 year of engineering, he switched majors to English. He studied the poetry of the Victorian and Romantic poets of the belles lettres. The degree focused on the great men of this period, their biographies and their works, and the beauty and meaning of the visions in their art. After a few years of that, Marshall then skipped across the pond to continue his studies at Cambridge, where he learned that the style of literary criticism he had just spent 3 years studying was dead. The 19th century approach to poetry, taught in Winnipeg, had been replaced in a growing number of schools by the new criticism of I.A. Richards, who taught at Cambridge. Thus, starting his English degree all over again, he learned from Richards how to analyze the techniques of poetry. How a poet used tools like rhythm, ambiguity, metaphor, juxtaposition, and words to form maximally effective communication. What developed from this double education in literary criticism was an acute sensitivity for how the content of poetry, all of the sensuous richness of human perception and thought, was captured and delivered in mere words alone. Well, mere on the page, but brought to life by a proper reading, as he learned from his dear old mama. McLuhan published many literary criticisms in the 40s and 50s. In them, he elaborated a broad historical analysis of the developments in poetic technique from the Romantics of the early 1800s through to the modern poetry of the 20th century. He described how the first Romantic poets, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, sought to fixate readers upon the harmonies and balance of nature, hoping to restore, in turn, a much-needed harmony and balance to their souls. All of society was becoming mechanized by both the technology of the industrial age and the cultural effects of applied Newtonian physics and Cartesian modeling of physical space. More and more, the world of the 1800s was becoming dehumanizing and being considered in very machine like terms. Even people were being roboticized. The Romantics carefully honed their senses to become in tune with the beautiful natural landscapes and the meaning within them. But, McLuhan noted, these English poets weren't able to go beyond nature to focus on the honing of the senses in and of themselves. That would be done by the French. In the essay Tennyson and Picturesque Poetry in 1951, McLuhan explains, quote, "If one asks what it was of landscape art that the Romantics and the Victorians did not achieve, it must be replied, le passage intérieur, which had to wait for Baudelaire, Laforge, and Rimbaud. It was this discovery that gave the later poets and painters alike the power to be much more subjective and also more objective than the Romantics. For all their skill in discovering and manipulating external nature situations by which to render states of mind, the Romantics remained tied to the object, when they wished only to present it as a point from which to leap to another kind of vision. So they repeatedly bog down in reflection just at the moment when they are ready to soar. They could not discover the technique of flight. By means of the interior landscape, however, Baudelaire could not only range across the entire spectrum of inner life, he could transform the sordidness and evil of an industrial metropolis into a flower. With this technique, he was able to accept the city as his central myth and see it as the enlarged shape of a man, just as Flaubert did in The Sentimental Education, James Joyce in Ulysses, and T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland." End quote. The dirty, crowded, inhuman industrial cities of the early 1800s drove the sensitive Romantics to pine for nature as a restorative. To bring nature and its healing properties to their readers, a poet like Wordsworth would, while meandering about the lush forests a few miles from Tintern Abbey, develop language to capture his own senses taking in the scene, retracing the very act of perception. Later, the French symbolist poets would reverse engineer these methods of encoding raw human sense perception and abstract them away from the nature scenes. They could then create poems which manipulated people's interior landscapes any way they wanted. They could, for instance, enchant the reader's perception of industrial cities to see in the cities the beauty of nature, or they could manipulate the reader's senses in entirely abstract, discontinuous ways, which had no ideas or logic, but were full of aesthetic emotions and sensations. These techniques will be brought back into English by the late 19th and 20th century modernist poets like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. But for McLuhan, of the modernists, it was James Joyce who perfected the approach of encapsulating raw sense perception in a world of ever-changing technology. Joyce's book Finnegan's Wake would feature very prominently in McLuhan's later works. McLuhan would do great things with this understanding of the poetic techniques of creating meaning in the interior of minds, including later on in his first book, The Mechanical Bride, in 1951, looking at advertisements and techniques which had been created out of, like Freudian psychoanalysis, recasting their manipulative properties in terms of a poetic technique, analyzing how advertisements manipulate people from an entirely different angle than the sort of manipulation theories that went into creating them in the first place, right? He also had the poetry, he saw these developments from the Romantics to the modern age. He saw it as part of all art, and so he often compared it to the developments in painting from the picturesque painters starting in the early 1800s, which began to experiment with, look at the hazy, dreamlike lighting effects of John Constable here, going through to Cézanne, who began to totally abstract away from the object towards more, abstract art, all the way straight through to one of his favorite 20th century styles, Cubism. The Mechanical Bride, 1951, actually gets its name from this sculpture by Marcel Duchamp, the bride stripped bare by her bachelors, even. Uh, this is technique abstracted away from content, the end result of 200 years after the Industrial Age. But before then, he had to complete his Ph.D. thesis. McLuhan's original plan for his thesis at Cambridge was to apply his developed sense for poetic meaning to 16th century English prose. But it gets really insane after that. He just goes right off the deep end while studying for this. I'm indebted to McLuhan scholar, editor, and biographer W. Terence Gordon, for making sense of any of this. As McLuhan began surveying more and more works, the weight of his findings sharpened his focus onto Victorian journalist Thomas Nashe. But unable to pin down the origins of Nashe's writing style, he extended the scope of his reading earlier and earlier and earlier, all the way into the medieval writings. Upon determining Nashe wrote in the style of classic rhetoric, McLuhan began an immense survey of rhetorical works stretching all the way back to the Roman Empire. Thereafter, he realized he also had to study the two other divisions of the liberal arts of ancient and medieval education, grammar and dialectic. Into these three divisions, known as the Trivium, that's rhetoric, grammar, and dialectic, McLuhan began to sort all of the styles of works that he had been surveying, noticing historical patterns over the centuries intervening from Cicero in the 1st century BC all the way through to the Reformation of the 1600s. He diagnosed the cause of many quarrels between contemporary thinkers and undue dismissals of ancient and medieval works by retrospective commentators as the result of a lack of sympathy between adherents of grammar, rhetoric, or dialectic who were unbalanced by the other two and thus in opposition to them. For instance, those prone to dialectic or logic would dismiss grammatical and rhetorical writers as primitive or sophist. Dialecticians, in turn, were accused of compartmentalizing knowledge and blinding themselves to truths expressed analogically, or metaphorically, not only by spoken and written words, but by nature and existence itself. By tracing this ancient quarrel, as he called it, over 16 centuries, McLuhan arrives at the conclusion that the Renaissance was not a retrieval of ancient wisdom from antiquity, but just one more blow in a war between the elements of the Trivium, which had been raging uninterrupted throughout all of the Middle Ages, going all the way back as far as ancient Greece. And, if so, then all of European literature since the 1500s needed to be reevaluated in light of the rich medieval intellectual traditions from which they emerged, rather than being treated as though they developed after some clean break from the past, attributable to the reemergence of classical Latin texts or the Protestant Reformation, for instance. He closed the thesis suggesting that his scholarly reinterpretation of Elizabethan and thus much of Western literature was only made possible by the advent of poets like James Joyce, who was able to demonstrate all of the possible ways of using language to express everything as some sort of culmination of the poetic innovation. As I said in the introduction of this series, McLuhan would eventually base his entire theory of media and technology off of his study of words, and it should be pretty obvious why. He grew up married to his dictionary. He was taught how to use words exceptionally well from a young age. His redoubled studies of English showed him how the poet's ability to capture and express and shape human sensory perception was developed like a technology in an arms race. And his study of the Classic Trivium showed him how, for most of Western history, reality itself had been made of words. The logos comprising words for rhetoric, words for grammar, and words for dialectic, all in a proper balance. After all this, it's about the time when McLuhan converted to Catholicism, understandably. You know how they say that 90% of communication is nonverbal? A fair corollary would be that 90% of what is written in a book depends on who is reading it. In the next episode, we'll focus on some books by two people, Siegfried Gideon and Wyndham Lewis, who were read early by McLuhan, and this will help us see how his later career was shaped by what he got out of them. Once we get to McLuhan's actual famous media theories, we're going to be able to use all of this behind our understanding of who he is and why he's saying it, and why he was so misunderstood but revered, but famous but hated, and all that stuff. He was big in this. He was very well known in the '60s, and we're gonna get the inside scoop doing it this way. So after after looking at some more of his inspirations, we're gonna dig into the meat of his stuff, and then we'll be able to look at computers as part of a total ecology of our man-made environments. Hope you're looking forward to it. I am. If you like this, support me, please. Subscribestar.com/ClintonTheGeek or Patreon.com/ClintonTheGeek. Until next time, take care and keep reading books. Later.